So stay quiet and soon it is.
So since this is a small group, I thought it might be helpful for Dave if you could just quickly introduce yourself, mention your class year, and for those who have maybe some work experience, like our 2Os and 3Os, you might share where you summered. It just gives Dave an idea of who's in the audience. If everyone here is like diehard youth law or civil rights or something else, you know, just to get a better sense of who's here. So I might start with Amelia. Sorry, I know you're chewing.
My name is Amelia. I am 1L, class of 2015. And I'm interested in the civil rights issues. 1L have some summer
Maybe.
My name is Chris. I've been here a while, I guess. 4L, I guess, would be the best way to put it. I've had, I've done internships at Public Advocates, Asian Law Caucus, and a couple bouts at the city attorney, and I guess my main area of interest is land use and housing equity.
I'm Alex. I'm a 3L. I summered for government consultancy in Norway my first year, and for the sort of environmental division of the California State AG my second year, and now I'm working with the city attorney's office doing like civil prosecution, which doesn't really make any sense, but it's totally a thing.
I'm Julia Forgey. I am a 2L, and I actually just transferred here from Duke. And last summer I spent at Earth Justice in New York doing environmental law, and probably going to be continuing to do something in that arena this summer.
I'm Tess. I'm a 1L. I haven't really done anything yet, but I'm interested in like criminal justice, especially with the juvenile office.
My name is Wayne. I'm also a first year, and I just got back from peace war in Bulgaria. And if I had to pick interest, it would be internationally bent human rights and potentially criminal justice.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm a 1L, and again, if I had to choose issues that I'm interested in, it's voting rights and women's rights and employment discrimination especially.
I'm Jessica. I'm also a 1L. And I, you know, as much as one can be interested without having spent much time in law school, I'm interested in civil rights stuff and particularly working in the South.
I'm Lorenzo. I worked for you my first summer. I studied Yelp with Bill Kosky last year, and so this last summer I could.
Cool. My name's Omar Sacker. I'm a 3L. I kind of have two sets of interest, international human rights. So I spent my first summer for a tribunal in The Hague, and then also kind of post 9/11 national security human rights stuff in the U.S. So I spent last summer at the ACLU in New York for the Center for Democracy. So working with Jimmy Neal and Hannah and the whole team over there. And I'm currently externing with the Public Defender, Santa Clara County. And I was in the International Human Rights Clinic here at Stanford last year.
I'm the assistant director of the Levin Center for 1Ls I haven't met yet.
Hi, I'm Kevin. I'm a 2L. I'm interested in crime policy, and last summer I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York.
I'm Marisa. I'm a 3L, and I'm interested in immigrants' rights and civil rights issues more broadly. My first summer I went to Buenos Aires and worked in a human rights organization that was so interested in human rights issues. And then this summer I was at the Legal Aid Society in the Law Center working in their national origin and language discrimination cases. And now I'm at the ACLU Immigrants' Rights Project.
Thank you, everyone. So we did send out Dave's bio through email, so I wasn't going to read through it again. But what I've told Dave, just so you know, is that this is a very informal, conversational talk. We didn't have to prepare remarks. But to talk a little bit about what he's done since graduating from Stanford, to give you an idea of what, you know, sort of, in his case, a mid-career public interest attorney has done since leaving Stanford, what has influenced his decisions, what his work looks like now, and then just to take questions and make this really conversational to be the most helpful for those of you in the room. Okay?
So, thanks everybody. It's good to be back. I was actually thinking about what I found interesting when I attended these sorts of things when I was a student here. And rather than starting at what I did right after law school, actually I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about what I did in law school also, just to give a little bit of perspective. I came to law school to become a prosecutor, move to the South, get my soft on crime bona fides out of the way as a Democrat and run for political office. That lasted the first semester of law school when I actually met deputy DAs and learned what their job was like, and that prosecutorial discretion was not generally exercised by line DAs. When I came to law school, I also had, I would say I was very skeptical of impact litigation in the civil rights arena as an effective approach to helping people. I now do impact litigation at the ACLU of Southern California, so that's kind of odd at some level. But when I sort of got through the first year of law school, I worked for a human rights organization. I was in the Philippines for the summer and worked largely doing documentation of conditions that young people were being held in jails in Manila. So I spent most of the summer working on that, as well as with a group that was involved in prosecution of American expatriate who was involved in sex trafficking of young girls in the Philippines. And after that experience, I came back, and then I ended up sort of getting a very good opportunity to work with Michelle Alexander, who used to be a professor here in a clinic that she taught that had to do with sort of civil rights litigation and a sort of critique of the approach that a lot of people brought to civil rights impact litigation. And that gave me hope that there was something that could be done as a civil rights litigator to help people and not actually make things worse. And I ended up spending my second summer at Lawyers Committee in San Francisco, doing largely school and sort of race discrimination work. And then I clerked for a year for district court judge in Alabama, Myron Thompson, and then got a Skadden Fellowship working at Legal Aid North Carolina doing education rights work that was largely focused on this basically litigation around the state constitutional right to education. After 3 years in the South, my wife said she was ready to come back to California. And so I ended up applying for and was fortunate enough to get a clerkship with Judge Fisher on the Ninth Circuit in Pasadena, and was then unemployed and landed in my current job, which I basically was hired to do largely juvenile justice and education work at the office. One of the sort of interesting things I think also about sort of what I do now, particularly the education side of it, is I didn't do any education work when I was in law school. I actually avoided education work when I was in law school because it's a black hole of public interest litigation, as I used to tell Bill Kosky. Because I mean, and again, you know, it's one of those things where when I was coming out of law school, sort of my resume screened kids. And so in looking at sort of what fellowship opportunities were out there, I found the sponsoring organization, and really the best fit as far as proposal ended up being this education project, for which I had no actual substantive experience, although I'd done a lot of work with kids, so hey, why not? And as a result of that, that's actually now largely what I do and focus. I would say most of my intellectual interests as a litigator and civil rights advocate focus in the education arena too, so it's kind of off. How things change, and so whatever you think you want to do when you come into law school doesn't mean you're necessarily going to do it apparently. So that's sort of how I got where I am now, I guess, in a pretty quick snapshot. If it's at all interesting, I can spend a little time talking about what I do in my current job. I can also, if you all have questions, you know, just interrupt a few questions or ideas. I'm not that interesting, so I'd rather talk about what you all are interested in hearing about. So please let me know if there's something that you're interested in. As I said, I was hired largely to support the education work that the ACLU of Southern California does. Our office, the ACLU is weird, so it's a national organization, but then there are these affiliates. They're separate entities altogether. And within California, there are actually 3 separate affiliates in California that are autonomous. We usually play nice together, but not always. And the Southern California office has focused largely on educational equity issues, and has done a lot of litigation related to school desegregation. The Williams case, which had to do with conditions and sort of access to textbooks and certified teachers in classrooms, was really driven by our office. And because of staffing changes in the office, there was basically sort of the senior attorney who'd really pulled all that stuff together for the last 30 years and no one else to really support that work. And so that was largely sort of what the position was intended for, that I was hired for, as well as the office had never really done juvenile justice work as a sort of dedicated area of focus. They've definitely done some advocacy in a couple of cases on issues related to juvenile justice over the years. But they were interested in, given the state of affairs in Los Angeles County in particular, sort of developing a little bit more of a proactive agenda around that issue. And so that's kind of what I was hired to work on, and that's what I spent pretty much the first 2 years that I was there. You know, I think I started on October 19th. We filed the first lawsuit about a juvenile detention camp on January 8th. Filed the second lawsuit about disproportionate teacher layoffs in LA County in February of 2010. And then we filed the next lawsuit about a widespread practice of charging fees for educational courses in public schools in August of 2010. So that's sort of, I was hired to write complaints and investigate facts and find clients and file lawsuits. And that's really what I was focused on for the first couple of years, 2 years in particular. And now, you know, it's kind of like getting tenure at some level, I think, where, you know, once you're there long enough, you can kind of do what you want. Which is really nice, and now I'm sort of structuring my calendar, or my docket a little more to do more policy work, and I do a lot of work. Even when I started, I was doing some work, but now my sort of distribution or allocation of time is shifting. So I spend a lot of my time working with community groups that are doing advocacy around juvenile probation, the juvenile courts, and school. Largely focused on school push-out, policing on campus, and school discipline, because that's sort of where the community groups are focused right now. There isn't really a whole lot of community focus on educational equity, so there's sort of this interesting disconnect where all my litigation is focused on educational equity, but most of the community work and partner coalition work is focused on school-to-prison pipeline and school push-out issues. And so that's, you know, pretty much what I do. I also work on other things, like I've done some voting rights cases. I worked on a case related to homeless veterans, basically the way the VA doesn't provide services for veterans, and a couple of other sort of more criminal justice directly related type cases. So that's largely what I do. It's pretty cool. But, you know, I can talk some more. But as I said, I'm not. I mean, I can tell you what I think is interesting. I can pontificate about lessons learned and all that stuff. But I'm interested to sort of hear what you all.
I'm curious because I'm also interested in doing impact litigation, but I also have questions about. Like, I also think it's important to know what the community actually wants. And so it's interesting hearing you say that the community organizations are more concerned with the prison to school pipeline issue, whereas the litigation you do is more about school equity. I'm wondering how the community's advocacy efforts informs the litigation you decide to bring, or if it doesn't really, or how those interact in terms of what are the community's priorities and then what are our litigation priorities, if there's any interaction between those two.
So the answer should be yes, that there is. I think that one of the things I said, I was very skeptical of impact litigation when I started out, when I came to law school, and I would say I left law school somewhat less skeptical, and because there's sort of this idea or the ideal of of community lawyering, client-based lawyering. I don't know if any of you all have done the community law clinic, where, you know, I did the community law clinic when I was here, and part of the whole thing is client-centered lawyering. It's a philosophy and approach to lawyering. And that I think that there's sort of theoretical frameworks that lawyers can bring to the work that they're doing in a community that is much more, you know, willing to be directed and take direction from the communities that are most affected by the policies. I mean, one of the things that I would say is that there are often disagreements among attorneys about how they should approach the work and where to allocate resources. And one of the critiques that is, you know, fairly common, and unfortunately, once you get out into practice, it's hard to avoid dealing with the fallout of this, whether it's funding, whether it's coalition work, whether it's grants, you know, it comes up constantly, is the idea of there is such a divide between community and the lawyers who do the work. And, you know, there's built into it also things like class, race, and gender that are unavoidable. You know, if you have a room, I can't tell you how many meetings I've been to with community people who are all not white, and then there's two lawyers in the room, both of them are white, right? I mean, that is what it is, and that's not always the case, but it is often the case, and that's a dynamic that I think sort of happens on a regular basis, at least in the work that I've done. But you know, the organizations work different ways, and so my organization has a case approval process that we have to go through, and so we want to file a lawsuit, we have to go through a case approval process. And the approach that I think comes to a lot of the work is where, I don't know, I'd say even for someone who believes it deep down in a philosophical sense, in the way that I do, about how important it is to be grounded in the community, take direction from the community, it's a heck of a lot easier to just do what you see and what's sort of there and ready to go. And so I think it's just a constant struggle. And I think the organization or sort of context in which you're working really influences that. Some organizations are much more disciplined and have built into their organizational structure and philosophy that connection to community. Others don't. And so it's harder in the latter to sort of hold to those ideals in some respect. But you know, I think that that's one thing where it's very interesting for someone, you know, a lot of the groups that I work with now, I've been working with them for over 3 years now, for at least some of them, are just in the last couple of months I've had some very interesting conversations with some of the student organizers and, like, you know, professional paid organizers that work at some organizations. They're like, you know, it's so weird working with a lawyer who actually says stuff like that. I've never worked with a lawyer that actually says that, or, you know, sort of like comes in and says, what do y'all need help with, right? Like for so many of the groups that I work with, they've never kept like you're an alien from outer space. If you're coming in and being like, hi, I'm interested in doing work on this issue, I know that you are doing work on this issue, is there anything that I can do to help? They're sort of like, whoa, you're trying to like manipulate us. You're gonna like try to find clients through us later, you know? I mean, but that has been the relationship for so many of you know, community groups and communities themselves for so long that I think it's an ongoing. I mean, gosh, you know, we've killed thousands of trees writing all of your articles about this stuff over the last 20 years. And it's one thing to read about it in law school, which is like this whole class that I took with Rachel Alexander was basically reading about this dynamic. And then when you actually get in it, it's, you know, you see it happening, and sometimes you see yourself being that thing that you detested or criticized, and you know, that's part of the challenge and struggle, I think. Yeah.
So you mentioned that, you know, you didn't do much education work in law school. I'm curious, like, what have you found to be valuable now that you're in practice that you gleaned from law school or post-law school? I mean, clerkships and other things you've done. I mean, what skills did you kind of obtain from those different experiences that have helped you do your current work? And what would you advise students going through the process to?
So I would say that bar classes are totally overrated. You are on quarters now, which I think is bad in some respects. I mean, you take more classes, but you get to do full-time clinics, so that's pretty cool. But I didn't take doctrinal classes really after my first year. I think I heard this. I'm not sure if it's actually true. that they passed a rule after I graduated limiting the number of clinics people could do.
Yeah.
But it was before they switched to quarters, but it was, because I did 4 clinics my second year. So,
It's the Dave Sapp.
It's the Dave Sapp rule. So we now have official confirmation. And I would say that for me at least, I can't, it was a very conscious choice for me because before I came to law school, I worked at a lobbying firm and hated it and quit. And so I knew I didn't want to work at a law firm. And so for me coming in, I wanted to figure out what would make me comfortable being a lawyer. And so the experiential things of doing, the volunteer work that I did, like my first year, I was involved in way too many student activities, and out of law school volunteer work. And then I did the clinics, and I did the externships, and I did, the summer internships, and those sorts of things to try to figure out sort of what would work for me. So I think I'm trying to remember, I did all of the mediation and negotiation classes that I could. I found that extraordinarily helpful, and I think that's one of the more challenging parts, particularly as a younger attorney coming into, especially if you're coming into an organization where you may not have a ton of day-to-day supervision. So like the first place that I worked where I was actually practicing was Legal Aid in North Carolina, which was I had a fabulous time there. My supervisor was terrific, but he was not holding my hand. And so the first week that I was there, I did a due process expulsion hearing all by myself. And so, I would say that in the course of walking in and feeling comfortable dealing with opposing counsel and doing negotiations, that if I had not done whatever the 2-3 classes, I did either 2 or 3 of the classes, I don't remember what they were, but I did negotiation, advanced negotiation, and one of the 1-credit ADR things or something. That I felt like that was very helpful, because that's something that you don't learn what works for your, how you can get a good outcome for your client through negotiation without practice. And so as a younger attorney, especially if you don't have a lot of supervision, I think having the sort of opportunity to learn what strategies work for you, how to map out outcomes and really think through negotiations is really valuable. I also did the, so that's sort of like the preface of what I would say about law school for me. But to answer your question directly, the things that are most valuable are civil procedure and jurisdiction. Like Fed Jur, I took Fed Jur my 3rd year, and civil procedure probably, what, at least the work that I do in large part is, a lot of the work that I do is coming up with sort of legal theories and figuring out how to frame litigation in a way that can get you to a place that you ordinarily can't get. So a lot of it is figuring, like the Camps case, which was the first one that I worked on, was basically a special education theory. It was this idea that there are all these kids that are locked up in a juvenile detention facility. Over 50% of them are disabled, so they're entitled to special education services. Almost all of the cases out there historically that lead to structural reform of detention facilities were special education litigation. The problem with special ed litigation is you have to exhaust remedies. So you have to file individual due process petitions, go through that process, and only then can you go into federal court. And what happens is you often get mooted out before you actually get to the point where you're ready to sue to get injunctive relief. And so what we did is we came up with a theory that allowed us to get around that, which is we said it violated due process under the Constitution to lock someone up and not give them basic rehabilitative services. But in figuring out how to do that, there are a lot of jurisdictional landmines that are out there. And so I would say, more than anything else, at least in my current job, the sort of federal courts, federal jurisdiction, understanding procedure, understanding sort of basic things like what are all of the garbage defenses that the other side can raise to get something tossed. Just knowing those and understanding the basic concepts and being able to think through how they might impact and where an investigation is from a legal perspective, I think is probably the most valuable thing that I've done from a law school perspective. That, of course, has nothing to do with the non-litigation work that I do, but at least from that part of what I do, I think that's probably, I never would have, people actually said that when I was in law school, which is kind of funny. Like, people would come back and be like, civil procedure is really important. Be like, oh gosh, that class, oh. But it's really, it really is true. At least, the role that I've had in developing the litigation, that's been my job, is to think through all of the nitty-gritty details and make sure we don't get tossed.
What about clerkships? Clerkships, are they valuable or?
Yes, especially also coming back later and doing another one.
So, yes, I would say, for me at least, I would not, I certainly would not have the job I have now had I not clerked. Just from the simple fact that Judge Fisher got me that job through two other people who shall remain nameless who work at this law school. Also, but that it's, so in that respect, I think that there's something to be said for the connection and the gold star associated with it, and so I think it's worth it to work hard and try to position yourself to be able to get a clerkship. I know that, for example, certain Skadden at least does give some credit to clerkships. Somewhat. It's not a bad thing to have a clerkship from that perspective, at least from what I understand. So I think it's, if that's something that is interesting to you and that you think you would enjoy, I think it's definitely worth it to try to go through law school and set yourself up to get there. At the end of my first clerkship, I was so ready to be done because I wanted to interact with human beings, which you don't do when you're clerking. And so, I think that there's also something to be said, if you went to law school to help people, that year of just sitting in a room doing research and writing can be somewhat frustrating. But more than anything else, I think that for me at least, the value in the clerkships is just doctrinally learning the law, understanding it. You work on stuff that I didn't even know certain laws existed. Like, has anyone ever heard of the Longshoremen's Act? It's this employment law about longshoremen, apparently. And there's a whole lot of litigation about it in the Ninth Circuit, and apparently I know more about the Longshoremen's Act than a lot of people do now, because I worked on several cases related to it. But even though I'm never going to practice that area of law,
You never know.
never say never, right? But they're very esoteric and weird areas of law, and having to learn them quickly, because that's the things that usually, if you don't know anything about it, you have to teach yourself about it. And oftentimes that happens in practice. You might have no idea what let's say you're in a legal services setting, a case comes in the door that no one in the office has ever dealt with before. You're going to have to learn about it. And so, it's definitely a very valuable skill. And I think also just sort of getting a broader survey and understanding of areas of the law. Like as I said, don't do bar classes. That's what bar, taking the sort of corporations and admin, those things give you that broader breadth. But that was sort of, for me, was a different way of getting that exposure to different areas of law was in clerking, because I was able to see, lots of different frameworks and perspectives. And I love me some diversity jurisdiction cases, nothing like property law cases, like, but I would find that interesting. But I really enjoyed those cases. So, for me, I really enjoyed it. I'm not sure it's for everybody, as far as I'm not sure it'd be as enjoyable for everyone, but I really liked, for me coming back, especially later, after having practiced for a while, I felt I got a lot more out of the second clerkship. One, because, I think I'd practiced, and so I was able to learn a little more and seeing what was going on in the cases, because I, had done a deposition. So when you look through the summary judgment record that comes out with the district court record on appeal, sort of being able to think through that stuff. But also sort of just missing the intellectual engagement, which, law school's fun because you get to do that stuff. And when depending on your practice area, I really enjoyed the education work that I was doing, but there's only like 2 Supreme Court cases on the fundamental right to education in North Carolina. So there's not a whole lot of further research and refinement left to do in that area. So it was nice to come back to a much more sort of diverse, intellectually stimulating setting. And I think in some respects that informed why I pursued the jobs that I'm in now, because I'm doing a lot of different things as opposed to really focusing in on one thing.
Can you talk about your day-to-day experience at these organizations, and even now sort of the shift from litigation to more of a policy focus, and what are your favorite things or most frustrating things about those 2 different areas?
So at Legal Aid, it was a legal services organization. It was I worked in a specialized office, so it was the children's unit of the statewide legal aid, so we sort of focused in on children's issues. And we had a much smaller caseload than a sort of standard staff attorney in a field office would. So I generally carried about 20 to 25 cases maximum during the time that I was there. And I would say that most of my time was spent driving all over North Carolina meeting with clients and then going to administrative hearings or doing community presentations, trainings, community legal clinics and things of that nature. That's what I spent a good portion of my time doing. I also, towards the end, once I sort of got away from the end a little bit, started doing some more like research, looking into data and those sorts of things. At the ACLU, I was actually talking with Anna before we came here. It's really hard to do litigation and policy work. There are organizations like our Northern California ACLU affiliate actually is structured this way. Their attorneys don't purport to do both. They have either policy attorneys or litigation attorneys. And one of the challenges of doing it and also doing coalition work if you're a litigator is if you have 3 briefs due, you have 3 briefs due. And so you can't make the monthly coalition meeting if you have 3 briefs due next week. And so being able to really, the reality is that litigation calendar takes priority over anything else on the docket because you don't want to commit malpractice. Whereas if I don't get the report written that I wanted to get written, I won't get disbarred. So so I think that one of the challenges, I think I've been saying for the last year and a half, I'm not going to take any more new cases, so that I have actual more time to spend on some of the policy stuff. But the work that I do now is unfortunately one of the things that I miss about it is I don't really spend a whole lot of time interacting with clients, and the client interaction can be is not nearly as gratifying in many levels because the nature of impact work is that you don't actually help people usually right away or ever, depending on what the case is about. And so there's something, it's really hard, and it's actually amazing the clients that I work with. I do explain it to most of my clients. This is part of my spiel when I'm working with clients, is I say, this is what our lawsuit is going to look like. I want to be honest with you. This is what the timeline looks like. We will try to move for a PI if we think we can move for a PI. The odds of winning, not that great. So, a lot of the clients that I work with know going in that if we win, it's not going to help them. And I actually find that pretty, or at least it's very unlikely that they're going to get any direct benefit, and that's just, it's remarkable to have that sort of, interaction with the clients. But at the same time, it's also kind of, 6 months, if nothing's happened in the case and you're still bickering with opposing counsel over whether they're going to produce discovery, it's kind of hard. I find myself, I don't call my client every week like I used to in North Carolina. Like every Friday I sat down and called every one of my clients in North Carolina. Now I don't do that as much because it's sort of like, yeah, nothing's happened. So the amount of client interaction is somewhat diminished. I'm able to work with students a lot because of the community work that I'm doing. Like we just did a series of presentations with one of the coalitions that I work with, sort of a presentation and training on a model discipline code and more positive alternatives to exclusion. And so I worked with the students who facilitated the training. So basically, I spent 2 days, well not 2 days, but 2 sessions sort of prior to the event, working to prep, working with the students to come up with what they're going to do, and then they actually did the facilitation. So that I really, that's fun, and I enjoy doing that. But again, it's hard. Like now, my litigation schedule is such that I had time to do that. Whereas for the last 6 months, I've pretty much just had one deadline after another, as far as briefs due or filing a lawsuit or something like that. So it can vary. But I'd say I spend most of my time sitting in front of my computer doing this. So, yeah.
I'm Betsy Delavega, by the way. I'm with the Levin Center also. Could you pick one of the cases you mentioned having filed a complaint in and sort of describe on a very nuts and bolts kind of level how that came to be a complaint?
Sure. Well, I'll do the juvenile. I'll I'll do the juvenile probation camp one, because that's a good example. So I started in I think I started in mid-October. There had been conversations among a couple of different offices about, this really awful problem in the county with what was going on in the camps. And so there were a couple groups that do individual client work, and so they represented some kids in some of the camps, so they were able to get in and see what was going on, at least in sort of anecdotal level. And so what I did when essentially when I started, there just wasn't staffing to chase it down, basically. And so what I did is I just went through the client file, well, I didn't go through, with waivers and authorizations from the clients of the other organizations. I went through their client files and looked at this, just basically went through and identified who might be a good plaintiff. Tried to set up a meeting with as many as I could, and then pulled together a whole bunch of, basically, they'd already pulled together 5 years worth of reports and audits and things like that, and just sort of having a binder. And basically, so just started going through all of the documentation that showed not only how awful things were, but that they'd been told how awful things were for years. And then started essentially just shaping the complaint based on what had already been identified as the deprivations of educational services and other things that students were in other, there was no programming. The kids were basically in their dorm, they were taken to school, they were shown, movies instead of being taught, and then they were taken back to their dorm, and that's all that happened. And so basically pulled that together, and then had interviews with a number of the students, and then talked my way into one of the camps, and started meeting with students, and through that process we identified 3 students whose families or they were willing to participate. And so we took basically their individual stories, got their student records, and had basically wrote out what you would call just sort of a broadside critique of how awful this place was based on the 5 years worth of documentation, and then had the individual client stories about specific things that had happened to them during their 6 months they were there. One of the clients had been there 3 different times. He'd received all of his high school credits from the school in that camp. He graduated with a high school diploma and was illiterate. And so that just writes itself at some level in a complaint. And so in the midst of that, then I was sifting through what the different legal theories were, and sort of working through the problem that we had of the exhaustion of the special education theory, and then looking into what a due process type cause of action might look like, finding cases where that had been used, pulling the good language, looking at the bad cases and figuring out what allegations have been included that had led to bad outcome, and basically writing the complaint to the good cases, using the language that those courts had used as the prose that we used in framing the legal theory. And then in parallel, we actually had due process petitions for the special education claims that we prepared for all 3 students that we filed contemporaneously with the lawsuit, so that the defendants saw that we were actually exhausting our special ed claims and would be crushing them if they didn't settle with us right away. And so we actually ended up getting, and we also wrote up basically a settlement proposal that called for a team of experts to come in and basically do a site visit and come up with recommendations that would be the basis of a settlement. And just sort of had all three pieces set up and ready to go when we filed the case, and we ended up actually sitting down with the lawyers for their side about a week after we filed. And we never had to do anything, never had to serve. They didn't even answer the complaint, actually, but then we ultimately settled the case. So that was one where basically the exposure that they had was so extreme that all that we had to do was figure out a colorable way to be able to get into federal court, that the risk of their losing a 12B1 was so great about what our attorney's fees would look like and what their exposure on the special ed claims would look like, that we could have bankrupted the county if they'd lost on the special ed theory. So that's so we basically structured the case to get them to the table as quickly as possible, and that's where the complaint came in. Was basically it was a PR document more than a legal document in the way that it was written. That's why we mined all of these old reports, Because it was not just, it's bad, that violates the law, it was, it's bad, you've been told about it, you're looking the other way, you've been told about it, you're looking the other way, you've been told this is illegal, you looked the other way, you've been told this was illegal, you fired the person. You know, so it was, the political implications for the people at the top were also pretty stark if they didn't come to the table very quickly. And so we basically ended up also having a little, you might call them talking points on how they could sell a settlement as they're taking responsibility finally. So it's not, you know, you can see it being used to like paint them in a bad light, but they only solved the problem because they got sued. So we basically told them how they could frame it as, this has been a problem, we know it's been a problem, it's been really hard to get our hands around it. This lawsuit really distilled and crystallized exactly what it was that we needed to do, and the proposal that they came with to bring in this outside team of experts was exactly what we needed to do, and so we did it. And so they were able to actually take credit for leadership for what they did also.
So you helped them save face.
Yeah, so we basically wrote it so it made them look like scumbags, but also had as the follow-up, and this is how you can look like a hero. If you take advantage of it in the next month, otherwise we're going to go after you in the media.
So when you filed the complaint, it wasn't publicized? Did you give
It was
them time?
publicized.
Okay, so.
And we
so
didn't,
you
we did not send a demand letter in that case either.
Okay.
Which we don't, the chief counsel, the guy that I work with, doesn't like demand letters very much. He likes keeping it tight and using the press around the event to sort of motivate the other side to come to the table. That, you know, in some cases, that's definitely, like in this case, that was the absolute right approach, because if it had gotten out that we were doing this, they would have had spin ready to go, and as it was, they were just blindsided, and so they didn't have anything to come back, so I think that we won that sort of PR battle. In other cases, I think there is a benefit to doing a demand letter. It can come back to bite you if you don't, but this was one where we chose actually, we called them actually the morning that as it was being filed, we called the county council and said, by the way, we're filing a lawsuit.
So that was a really bad day for them.
That was a very bad day.
What was the timeline of the whole, from like starting to do the research to?
So from starting working on it to having the complaint filed was basically 2.5 months. And then from when we filed it till when we got a settlement finalized was just under a year, but there was an interim settlement agreement, and so basically it was a two-part step. So we got a settlement agreement, they would bring in this team of experts to come up with recommendations. That took like 2 months to get there, and then the report, the site visit and the report writing, and then the negotiations of what the settlement would actually look like was very the settlement agreement was like 95 pages. Of awesomeness. Once we actually got the final settlement agreement, so that took a lot longer to hammer out.
I have a question. How do you decide to pursue litigation on a particular issue as opposed to using other routes? Is litigation kind of your last effort when nothing else works, or is it the first go, or what?
So in an ideal philosophically, I would say that generally I think that thinking of litigation as a means of last resort is probably, you know, where I come from philosophically. That's not always what happens practically in my organization. We're a litigating office primarily, and so that there's a philosophy of approaching things from what claims can we bring if someone comes to us with a problem, as opposed to how can we solve this problem. It's an ongoing process of correcting that and sort of trying to approach things differently sometimes. I think that very often, though, a lot of the things that come into our office, it's quite clear that there's nothing short of litigation that will get them to do. You know, a lot of the times when we file litigation, it's after, like for example, the Camps case is in my view the perfect example. I did not feel guilty at all about not sending a demand letter. because they had had so many opportunities to fix the problem. Why should they be able to, when they finally get threatened with a lawsuit, clean up their mess? Like, the idea is people need to pay the price for not being proactive, is one way of looking at it. And so in some circumstances, particularly with kids, these kids were being ignored, that no one cared about them, and they knew no one cared about them in LA, generally, like the general public just doesn't care. And so they were able to get away with it. And so the only way to, if we said, hey, you need to fix this, even if they agreed to do it, there wouldn't have been any political price for it. And so now at least there's a consciousness about we need to do what's right with these kids, otherwise we might pay a price. And so I think that in some instances, that kind of calculus, whether it's explicit or not, like in that case, it was actually an explicit decision where we went through that decision-making process. I think other times it can be used as a rationalization. You can say, oh yeah, they wouldn't have changed if we, without a lawsuit, but generally, I think with the cases that I've worked on since I started at the ACLU, it's approached not from what are our options? Okay, well, we've tried all these things, now let's sue. It's not very, some organizations work like they have a long-standing advocacy campaign and you build up to it, like Advancement Project. I don't know if you're familiar with the Advancement Project. But they will basically, they will come in and say, there's a problem that either we or community has reached out to us based on this problem we've identified. And so we're gonna come in and study it. And then we're gonna look at all the strategies and options, and then we're gonna move forward. And usually their approach has been, they'll come and do data analysis, public records requests, then engage in sort of advocacy at like the board, city council, school board type level, and push and push and push with their community groups that they're working with. And then if they get when they get blown off, then they sue. If they think there's a legal claim there, and I like that approach. That's sort of that's the approach that I generally would be inclined to take. And so, but sometimes someone comes in and says, I want someone to represent me to sue this person. Like we get legal intakes all the time where someone says, I need legal assistance with this. And so to go back to that, people be like, oh, that's really interesting. We're going to write a report about that. So I think again, it ends up being a little more complex in practice, or at least for me at least, it's ended up being more complex in practice than I thought it would be. But generally, like in the areas where I am, I am the senior attorney working on this stuff, that's generally the approach that I bring, is to look at the problem, figure out what solution is going to work, and if litigation is very often the only solution that will work, then that's what we do, but to at least think through and not just assume, let's sue. Just because you can file a suit doesn't mean you should, I guess, is the way I would say it.
So one of the interesting things about the ACLU is that very often the government is, or its representatives are sitting across the table from you in lawsuits. And I'm wondering what unique challenges or opportunities having that sort of dynamic, where it's a nonprofit against a public agency. How does that change the litigation, if it does?
I don't know, I've never sued anyone other than government, so I don't really know what it's like. Really.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things is that it does help to know, I'm not sure it's really that different from private litigation, but you need to know what the other side's interests are and the motivations are. There are very different interests and motivations and also decision-making process in government. I'm not gonna talk about politics, but the Obama administration made one change that has drastically affected my job. It was actually, I think, one of the first things that they did when they came into the Department of Justice is it is a hard firewall between the political shop and DOJ once litigation is filed. They did it in response to allegations of political interference in litigation about when they decide to settle or when they decide to fight based on past administration practices. But it really sucks in some of my cases, like in one of my cases where we're suing and it is such an obvious political solution, but they won't do it because there's litigation pending. Which, is kind of backwards from the way that I would think about it. Sort of like, no, you do it so the case goes away, and then it's a win, and everyone can go home happy. But, so understanding that that's the rule in DOJ now can affect how you approach whether to pursue litigation or what to do once you file litigation. Like I said, we're spending time trying to build public pressure to shame them into changing their conduct. Well, no, because DOJ is giving it over to the lawyers, and they don't care. They don't care about what's right and just, they just want to win. And that's my criticism of DOJ. For other agencies, it's a different dynamic. So for municipalities or school boards, the threat of attorney fees means something sometimes. So if you're an organization that can get attorney's fees or seeks attorney's fees if you prevail, that's a dynamic that, for better or for worse, is going to be going on in a case. The embarrassment that they can have, like there's a case that I'm working on. We filed it against a school district and police department where they basically rounded up all the Latino kids and herded them into a room and interrogated them and took mugshots as a demonstration of what it would be like if they were in a gang. And so, we sued them, and it's not that more than, it's been amazing to me that more than anything else in the conversations about resolving this case, the number one priority for them is that nothing that happens makes it look like they're admitting to engage in racial profiling. The sense in this particular community, the race dynamics and sort of what's going on in that political sort of dynamic are so strong that it hurt them so badly when that case was, we didn't really realize it actually when we filed the case, that was gonna be as much of a leverage point as it ended up being. But the board, both the board and the city council that were involved were just, the allegation that they had permitted profiling of Latino students was really damaging to them. And so, in smaller communities, it's a different dynamic than in LA, for example. Like, sue the city of LA, they're like, oh, we're being sued again. But if you sue someone else, that's a big deal sometimes. And so I do think that it's, there are different dynamics with different levels of government, sizes of government, and sort of places, and also what policies they take. Like, the state of California has a very different way of approaching litigation from the federal government, as far as, what role the Attorney General office will play, or the general counsel for the agency involved will play. And so it can be a totally different experience litigating education cases against the state compared to environmental cases against the state, compared to voting cases against the state. Like, I'm dealing with 3 different deputy attorney generals right now in different cases, and it's a totally different experience, because the dynamic about what they do when they sort of tender representation is very different. And so, I think it's probably the same thing in private litigation, where it varies depending on who the other side is, probably. But I do think that there is a really big difference, at least in the sense that the PR consequences can be very different and more powerful, but at the same time, there's also a much greater risk that the bottom line doesn't matter in the way that it would. Like, I think most private litigation, they can be sane in their cost-benefit analysis in a way that government lawyers don't always have to be. Because that's just the taxpayers that pick up the bill, right? So I think that I've noticed that also, that against certain agencies who shall remain nameless, they don't care if they're taking a ridiculous position that's going to expose them to exorbitant attorney fee liability to make us have to litigate that issue. They don't care. They just want to be obstreperous and delay the case as much as possible. And there's no one to hold them accountable in a way that a board of directors would fire a general counsel if did that in a different context. So.
One or two more questions?
Everyone has the same question.
All you.
I was a little curious about, you mentioned now that you've been there at the ACLU 2 years, you have a little bit more autonomy over kind of your caseload, but you also mentioned there's like a case approval process. I know this is too specific to ACLU, but I was curious about that balance. I know a lot of us have passions on certain issues, and kind of course, when you enter the NGO world, there's NGO politics and there's different issues. I'm curious kind of what your experience has been in managing that line. And then also, maybe a related question is about, because I know that ACLU office does some national security and other work, and what kind of flexibility would there be if you wanted to get more in those areas, and how does that work exactly?
So, I've worked only in 2 organizations, so that's the perspective I have, but I also know a lot of people who work lots of other places. And so I do have some sort of basis of comparison, which is just say that each process is different organizations have different processes. Some of them have really engaged and active boards, which can be good and bad. Some of them don't have engaged or active boards, which can be good or bad. Sometimes you can just do whatever you want, which can be good or bad. Sometimes you have to go through 8 levels of approval, which can be good or bad. So I think, my experience at least has been that in the litigation context, it's more just been frustrating, but it's not at times, sometimes, to be sort of like, oh, do I really have to respond to that email? What a dumb question. Page 9 of the memo, I already answered that question. Or, like it's more just sort of exasperating because I want to do whatever I want to. Right? So I don't know if it, so that's the experience where it's sort of like, no, I should be able to do whatever I want to. And that's in the litigation context. There are other offices though where I'm really glad that we do have those checks in place, because it is very useful to have to think through all that stuff beforehand. And so, I actually am amazed at some offices, they don't even have to write a litigation memo, where you actually identify what the legal theories are before they authorize you to file a lawsuit and get that organization on the hook to follow through on the litigation. So, I think that more and I think that this is more just probably true more of like the nonprofit world in general is becoming more professionalized, and so I think like the newer generations of EDs are becoming much more focused on board development, managing their board more effectively, having better processes and strategic planning. Like it's amazing how poorly run civil rights organizations are, just across the board. Like it's startling how badly managed a lot of civil rights organizations are, unfortunately. And so I think that a lot of groups are, grappling with that and moving in different directions. So as far as like how to shift, can you do different sorts of work, is a lot of it has to do with the job description. A lot of organizations hire people to work on specific projects, and it's largely because so much funding now is grant-based, where you get money to do education, or you get money to work on school discipline in South Central Los Angeles. And so you have to do school discipline work in South Central Los Angeles, even if there's something else that walks in the door that is much more interesting, much more pressing, and much more important. And so depending on whether it's a general funding position or a grant funding position, that can have a lot of influence over what sort of flexibility people will have in the positions that they start in. I think it's becoming, I think it's really rare for people to come in as generalists in civil rights organizations now, although you will probably have a much better perspective on it because you see more, you actually read the job postings before sending them out probably. But that's why I say I'm really lucky. I'm really lucky that because I was only 4 years out of law school when I started at the ACLU, and I was from the moment I got there, as long as I did sort of the work, and it's not like I didn't want to do those cases, so it's not like I was told do this. It was like, oh, we want to hire you to do this. Oh, and there's this case that we can file, and I was like, great, let's do it. So I was basically able to do whatever I wanted from the moment I started, and I was able to sort of branch out into areas even though I was hired largely to do education, juvenile justice, I can do other stuff also. And so and that's really, really rare, and that's why I say it's really fortunate. I was really lucky to get it, because I do think that it's a terminal position in that respect, because it's so rare to be able to be in a place where you can sort of make your own docket, particularly with the way that funding is working now in the nonprofit sector with grants and everything, where so much is driven by you have to do certain things to meet certain benchmarks and rules, and so that's what you have to work on. So, although I have a grant report that's due on Friday, so.
So this is kind of a basic question, I guess. You have mentioned kind of repeatedly that you owe a lot of where you are right now to kind of luck, random chance. And I wonder how you think that should shape our experiences, while we're here in school. Like, how should we balance the desire to go all in on some particular subject matter, or try to position ourselves for some set of jobs, and how much should we just kind of be like, screw it, whatever? Like,
So, you know,
something.
Detrimental
I'm not on camera.
So I would say that you know, it was.
I don't mean screw it in a negative way. It's like something, you know, I'll just kind of keep doing these random sets of things.
I would say, you know, and we do sort of for our summer students, I do like a career talk thing, whatever. And this is actually say this to the students who work at the ACLU in the summer also, is that I don't think it matters as long as you are intentional about building relationships with people who fight for you. Because what I said about is pure dumb luck. It was not dumb luck.
Yeah.
It was people making calls and looking out and sending an email being like, hey, look at this job, this is a really good job, you should go for it. And so it is, you know, and I'm always self-critical, and I never keep in touch with people the way that I should, but I mean, there are people, you know, at this law school that it's important to have two people who will write a phenomenal letter of recommendation for you. And it doesn't have to mean that you're the top student in the class and write a phenomenal exam, because actually that's a terrible letter of recommendation. But if you want to do public interest work, it's more someone who knows you, knows what motivates you, knows that you believe in what you're doing, knows that you're going to work your tail off to help other people, and believes in you that if they're willing to call someone up and go to bat for you and put their reputation on the line. And, you know, you all are here, so that means that you're pretty amazing people. And so it's just finding and building and being intentional, and, you know, this might sound a little not creative, it's the wrong word, a little sort of crass, but you need to be thinking and choosing what you're doing, whether it's courses, clinics, internships, volunteers, research assistantships, activities, who those people are going to be, and build those relationships. And so, you know, it's not necessarily find the most famous professor in the law school and just be a brown nose, but it's figuring out who is doing something that you will be able to demonstrate your passion and skills and abilities that will then be able to relay that to people when you need a favor, right? So like, I got the clerkship that I got right out of law school because Pam Carlin called Myron Thompson. I got, you know, the fellowship that I got because of Diane. You know, so there's very little where I'm saying it's dumb luck. It's nothing to do with me, in the sense that it's not like I was any better than any other applicant out there. In fact, most of them were smarter and had better grades than I did probably. But it's that there were people who knew and had those connections who were willing to use them, you know, to help out. And to me, I think that's the most important thing. And so as long as you're doing something that you enjoy and appreciate and will be able to be good at, then build a relationship with the people who are involved in that, and those are the people that you'll be able to rely on to get where you want to go. Because, you know, at least my experience has been, I had no idea when I started law school, I'd be in LA of all places, doing civil rights work in education. Like, you know, I never would have thought that when I started law school. I wouldn't have thought that when I graduated law school. And I wouldn't have thought that when I was working in North Carolina. But I'm really happy with where I am and feel really blessed. So, you know, but it's largely because of, you know, connections from here and elsewhere that have opened those doors. And, you know, there is some element of dumb luck. Like, I happened to come out of my clerkship when a job opening came open a month later. And, you know, I was unemployed, which sucked, and then all of a sudden this awesome opportunity came up. So, you know, it worked out. But
On that note, thank you so much, David, and thanks everyone